The long-standing, nearly apocalyptic, and nuclear surviving series has been battling ferociously against many bosses along the way. So many at this point, there's likely enough to fill a full city with and have a nice suburban village of lycans and vampires nearby. Let's look at every mainline Resident Evil and decipher which boss stands out the most among each, terrify gamers the most, and have contributed the most to a society of terror from what started as a little old pharmaceutical company in Raccoon City. Let's melt off the layers of terror and peel away what made them stronger and better than most. Resident Evil Boss Face-Off Edition, but with not a literal face-off. Where it all began. Prequeling the series, but due to numerical laws that require us to start where numbers begin at 0.
Resident Evil 0.
A game that conflicts most fans in the series as either too wonky a character system, an unnecessary entry, or just an adorable sequence of Rebecca pre-Resident Evil 1 DLC. Whatever you choose to believe, this game comes down to a bunch of animal-based bosses and a proto-tyrant. I wouldn't say any boss is overly terrifying unless you squirm at the sight of leeches and bugs, in which case, you're screwed. Figuring out what boss in this game makes the best simply comes down to a tyrant or some overgrown animals. The tyrant in this game makes a handful of appearances, but anything of substance beyond test tube monster makes it a dull boss prospect without any lore or story to accompany it. Marcus, grandfather of this residence of evil, corpse turned leech monster, is the central boss of the entire game. Marcus's backstory in multiple forms and revenge plot are a runaway train stealing the show.
Resident Evil.
Officially where it all began nearly 30 years ago. Using a compilation of every iteration of the original, but seeing as the remake version has everything and more, it's the de facto version to go off of for containing the most bosses. The animal theme that runs rampant in the series for quite some time is true here as well. A snake, spider, shark, as well as an overgrown plant flood the boss list. We have a couple humanoids as well, with Lisa Trevor, a mutated child, and the OG Tyrant. I deemed the Head Crimson Head a mini-boss, not making the cut. Choosing a top 5 list was relatively easy. Dropping one of the animals made the most sense, and I'd say the least intimidating boss in the game is Black Tiger, the large-ass spider. One of the easier bosses to defeat. Snakes and sharks are probably scarier than most spiders anyways. I said most. Lisa Trevor is the wild card here. Her tragedy of a backstory and being tested on. Also, history with the mansion itself, with her father being the architect, and both of her parents dying here in the mansion. She takes the crown, but she was also exclusive to the remake version, so the second place tyrant would have likely won if not for her inclusion.
Resident Evil 2.
If you played Resident Evil 2, any version, new or old, there's not a lot needed to identify the best, most terrifying boss within the game. The central story revolves around the G virus. The main scientist, main culprit, and non-stop boss encounter is William G. Birkin in all his many forms. Mr. X is neat to have, but he's just an opening act, and the main performer is Will, the evolving Super Tyrant. The original Resident Evil 2 differs slightly in boss selection with the addition of a giant moth, slightly different take on the alligator battle, but same explosive result, and more or less the same thing as the remake. Mr. X likely would have won if he visited other entries on this list in other games, but as far as winning Resident Evil 2, he lacks the communication to pull it off. If the last game was a predicted landslide, this game's best boss is all but a guarantee.
Resident Evil.
Picking a boss besides Nemesis in a game originally titled Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, at least in the US, seems extremely foolish. In fact, it's actually impossible to pick any other boss in the remake version, well, because Nemesis is it, the only option. The original at least gave us an additional option, going from a whopping 1 boss character to 2. Am I taking a giant worm that isn't all that unique over Nemesis? Nemesis wins by default. However, if we take it a step further, which form of Nemesis is the best? In the original game, I'd argue his first form. He chases you sporadically and relentlessly through the city for a large portion of the game. In the remake, he's a bit underwhelming. His second form, transformed like a large dog running around buildings in front of the clock tower, I'm sorry, I had to say it, is right up there. The Alien Queen iteration at the end is cool but crude. A giant laser cannon might be canon to the series, but it's almost too over the top for me to pick it. The original game's first form Nemesis carries Resident Evil 3 on its back, getting the win. The first shift in boss etiquette begins with Code Veronica. All the bosses feel a bit more organic, and we're not picking a pool of bosses relegated to only animals or tyrants. Now, it's that, plus some true weirdos. The spider is a repeat, instantly stomped on, leaving us Resident Evil 3's worm cousin, another tyrant, Nosferatu, who is the father of Alfred and Alexia, but mutated, and Alexia herself in a few forms, and also a mutant salamander from Stranger Things. You'd think Wesker would have been included, but he's relegated to cutscenes only, being shunned until Resident Evil 5. I wouldn't conclude any boss to be overly terrifying, maybe terrifying in the put some clothes on sort of way though. Tyrant. Alexia likely steals the show, even though narratively Wesker eclipses the main story thread in intrigue value. As we said a second ago, still not a boss.
Chris.
The salamander thing does kind of freak me out because it seems headless. Nosferatu has the creep factor, but Code Veronica never really dives into his lore much beyond creepy monster locked in a basement. Even the boss fight itself is shrouded in fog and disappointment. Likely a contender for most poorly designed boss fight in the Resident Evil franchise. Resident Evil 6 says shut your mouth. That's actually a good question. Let me know your answer below as I'm curious. Alexia carries the story of the game and Nosferatu is barely involved. The Tyrant, we've done this before, and you didn't win then either. Alexia takes Code Veronica. Wesker waits patiently for his turn later on.
Resident Evil 4.
Likely the most balanced entry on this list. Resident Evil 4 both old and new, spread out the share of time in the spotlight quite a bit. Early on, the tall, dark, and silent bearded man, Vitores Mendez, takes us for a walk for the early stages, being outdone pretty quickly when Salazar arrives, at least in the original. There's a huge disparity of quality between the original and remake with Salazar. He's insignificant and vastly reduced in dialogue in the latest iteration. Krauser is the opposite. Expanded upon more in the remake and pretty one note in the original. The boss U3, not even a boss in the remake until Ada's DLC released later on. Verdugo is a silent henchman monster, which leaves us with Sadler at the end. The original makes a huge case for Salazar being the most standout boss in the game. His non-stop banter with Leon until Leon finally gets to shut him the hell up is so satisfying. In the remake, he was just another boss along the way. I have to split Resident Evil 4's choice in two, as the answer differs for the original and the new remake. Salazar wins in the original, and Krauser for the remake. At long last, Wesker. Resident Evil's dad, Chad, is ready to fight. First, we have the likes of a bat-like creature with a bumblebee butt. Irving transforms into a giant squid thing. Excella steals our hearts before being betrayed and imploding into a goopy mess. A masked fighter who kicks the Valentine way to second place. We all know where this was heading. Albert Wesker. After too many Resident Evils of not actually allowing the player to duke it out, he goes out in full volcanic explosion. Resident Evil 5 doesn't treat its bosses very well, with loads of backstory and intrigue, most being single-use herb sprays of involvement. Excella seemed to get some development before poof. The masked individual is a big question mark until being revealed as a chest-controlled Jill Valentine. Wesker not only betrayed Excella, but also used Chris's closest partner, Jill, against him. Wesker receives the outright Best Boss Award for Resident Evil 5. It was likely never a real competition for this game anyways. Where to even begin? This may get relegated to commentary vote, as there's so many more villains in this game. It does have 4 campaigns full of them. A handful stand out more than the others, but deciding the best may be best left undecided. Each campaign has more of a boss theme used in it. Chris's is more geared towards what was in Resident Evil 5. Leon gets not just the ladies, but the classic zombie and plaga-like enemies. Sherry gets discount nemesis. Ada gets, well, kind of herself, Ada. Simmons is the overarching villain in this game. Deborah was also a main plot point in Leon's campaign. Ustanok was pretty much the solo option in Sherry's, rounding out with the final bosses in Chris and Ada's with Carla and House. Resident Evil 6 does tend to have, overall, some of the creepiest assortment of bosses in the franchise, slightly cheating just due to sheer volume. Carla, Simmons, and Deborah have the most developed stories surrounding them, giving their battles the most weight, even if the battles themselves aren't necessarily the game's best. Simmons turns into a T-Rex-like entity, playing out like Jurassic Park with miniguns. It's both ridiculous, out of place, but still manages, after throwing away all credibility, to be somewhat fun. Carla turns into giant face on the wall, making her omni-wall potent. Out of all these options, Simmons, Deborah, and Carla are all viable options. It's a coin flip for me between Deborah and Simmons. I'll go edge Deborah, as I found that plotline more interesting than the entirety of Simmons pre-T-Rex. The resurrection of evil and the franchise heading back to the roots in houses of horror. Resident Evil 7 separates from the norm we've come accustomed to by having mostly human or human-esque like bosses throughout the entirety of the game. Mia, Jack twice, Marguerite, and Evelyn. Marguerite comes in last due to Mia mattering more. Jack and Evelyn taking the reins on time spent terrorizing the player. Mia definitely has one of the most memorable fights in the game, occurring pretty early on as she chainsaws her way through walls, but then that's about it. Evelyn is the mystery box character throughout, spending time more clouded in mystery until the end. That leaves us with Jack in Form 1 and Form 2. Jack pursues you for a good length of the game, then reappears later in a fully mutated state. I'd say it's likely that most players come away from this game with Jack having the lasting impression as the main nemesis, not Evelyn. Jack pulls first place from out under the rug as, in my opinion, the top boss of Resident Evil 7. The last entry on this list, Resident Evil Village, also continuing what Resident Evil 7 just did, sticking more to the human element of design in bosses. Sure, vampires, werewolves, and fishy friends aren't quite the same as a molded family. The witchy daughters get bundled together and right off the bat, unintentional pun, don't fly to the level of Lady Dimitrescu, head vampire. The thing Village does well for the first half of the game is establishing this vampire family and a lot of their motives, as well as inflicting their wrath upon Ethan. But then that halfway mark hits, and now they're all dead and gone, moving us to Heisenberg, whom in comparison is really more irksome, doesn't look at all intimidating, just juggles around some metal, basically. His motivations are muddled on whether to kill Ethan or not, and then back to kill him again. Too wishy-washy for me and my taste. The fishy guy is too nice and makes a bunch of funny burping noises like I'm fighting some Banjo-Kazooie boss back in the days of Nintendo 64. That just leaves what to do about Mother Miranda. She briefly appears every now and then in cutscene, disguised as an elderly. Wouldn't say it was shocking that the crazy evil sounding village hag witch doctor was actually the evildoer behind everything. Minus points for plot stupidity. As much as Miranda still carries a lot of the game throughout, never did I feel the imposing will or utter terror from her in the game. Lady Dimitrescu always came through, at least for half the game. Maybe not as terrifying as her overly large stature suggests, but she was by far and away the most memorable after Ethan clipped all the boss's wings. Our last crown is given to the Queen Vampire, Lady Dimitrescu. With all of our champions picked for each boss in every Resident Evil mainline game, what changes would you make? Did you have a different experience with any boss in any entry on this list compared to me? If you did, please comment in the comments below. Thank you for watching. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you next time on Hittobox.